They say Ash Hollow buries its secrets deep. But that dawn, the gallows weren't ready for Josie Marrow. They called her poison, the ghost they had to hang to feel clean. A frayed rope, a bruised face, no last words. Then Leland Crowe came like a storm. Black horse, black duster, eyes promising graves for every liar there. He didn't bargain, didn't beg. He just growled, "Get your hands off my wife, or get ready to dig your own graves." One shot cracked the sky, snapping the rope, snapping every truth they'd buried under their boots for years. When Crow lifted Josie through dust and gunfire, she whispered, "If I swing a ghost." Ash Hollow learned, you can bury the girl, but never what she knows. They say Ash Hollow never let a secret breathe too long. The wind carried gossip faster than prayers, and every lie grew roots if you watered it with enough fear. Josie Marrow learned that before she learned her own name. She was 7 when the fever took her mother. A dry cough turned wet, wet turned black. And in the final hours, the whole shack smelled like rotting sage and old sweat. No preacher came to bless the body. No neighbor knocked to see if the girl inside had food in her belly or a blanket for the frost. By the time the sheriff rode by, Josie was curled beside the corpse, too numb to cry, staring at the mold on the ceiling boards and counting each breath like it might be her last too. When they buried her mother under the splintered fence behind the livery, Josie didn't weep. Old Meg, the laundress, pressed a crust of bread into her palm and whispered, "Keep your eyes down, girl. Keep your mouth shut." That was mercy, as close as Ash Hollow ever came to it. By 12, Josie was a ghost sweeping sawdust and spit from the floors of Nolan's saloon. Nolan claimed he gave her charity, called her the stray mutt behind her back, but let her sleep in the pantry on a pile of potato sacks. It was warmth of a kind, if you didn't mind the rats. Each night she'd scrub sticky beer from the floors until her knuckles bled. The bruises she learned to hide behind stale whiskey fumes and the rank smell of old men's breath. Nolan taught her early. A girl who listens lives longer than a girl who talks. And Josie listened, but her silence made folks uneasy. Nobody trusted a girl who didn't whimper when the belt came down. By 14, she knew better than to fight back when a drunk ranch hand shoved her behind the ale barrels. She knew better than to raise her voice when Nolan accused her of pocketing tips she never saw. But every so often, kindness leaked out of her like a crack in a boarded-up window. Little Jesse, the stable boy with lungs too weak for ranch work, would show up at the back door shivering. Josie would slip him scraps, the burnt heel of a loaf, cold potatoes scraped off a plate nobody finished. The third time Nolan caught her, he backhanded her so hard she tasted blood for days. But the next week, Jesse was back, and so were the scraps. Mercy was dangerous. It made you a target in Ash Hollow, but some part of Josie never cared enough to stop. Old Meg would come by every Sunday with a basket of shirts and linens from the preacher's house. She'd sneak Josie half-stale bread if she could, sometimes a boiled egg wrapped in a rag. "Keep your eyes down," Meg would hiss. "You're too pretty for their mercy. Pretty girls get blamed for every sin these bastards are too scared to name." And so the story grew, like rot under the floorboards. They said Josie Marrow was poison. She bewitched men into spending coin they didn't have. They said she looked at Nolan's ledger book once, and the next day, the money vanished. They said she had a devil's mark, the faint scar on her shoulder from a branding iron she got when a ranch boss accused her of stealing bread. In Ash Hollow, proof was never needed. A woman's guilt was decided in the alleys and the pews, traded between housewives like lace secrets. By the time the sheriff came to nail the notice to the saloon door, "Murderess, thief, to hang at dawn," no one asked where the real money went or how Nolan ended up face down in his own spittle. They just nodded, spat in the dirt, and said, "She always was trouble." Blood on the dirt was the only truth Ash Hollow trusted. They didn't care if the story was real, only that it fit their hunger for someone else's ruin. And Josie, she stood quiet at the center of it all, wrists rubbed raw from rope, dress stained with dirt and spit. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Because in Ash Hollow, mercy was just another word for debt. And Josie Marrow didn't owe them a damn thing. If you asked old Meg, she'd say Josie was dead the day they nailed that notice to the door. The noose just made it official. In little Jesse, he'd slip through the square at dawn, peeking from behind the wagons, clutching the burnt crust Josie once gave him. He'd listen to the hush before the hangman's rope pulled tight, and in that hush, you could almost hear Ash Hollow breathe, hungry for a girl's last truth. A truth they'd bury, same as they buried every mercy they ever owed. Long before dawn ever cracked its first bone over Ash Hollow, Leland Crowe was already riding with ghosts on his back. They called him half a legend, half a warning, a man who'd once fought for something clean in a war no one remembered winning, and who'd learned afterward that killing for pay was easier than living with an empty belly and a mind that wouldn't sleep. The rumor started in Elkhorn Ridge. Girl framed, price on her head, says she's poison. In Dustfall, it was a barkeep with 2 teeth and a bounty poster half drowned in beer. Pretty little thing. Slit her boss's throat, took his coin, fled south. Easy money, Crowe. But Crowe just folded the paper, tucked it deep in his coat pocket like it weighed more than iron. He drifted from one broken town to the next. Coyote Bluff, Griever's Pass. Each night lighting a fire just big enough to keep the cold from eating him alive. But no flame burned away the girl's name. Josie Marrow. A name that kept him wide awake, eyes staring into the coals, seeing his own sins crawl through the shadows. It should have been simple. Ride in, 1 bullet, clean work, take the coin, keep drifting. Crowe had done it before. He'd done it for men twice as dangerous and women who'd begged him for mercy through cracked teeth. But Josie's silence lodged in him like shrapnel. A ghost of himself when he was just Private Leland Crowe, digging graves for boys too young to die in a uniform that didn't fit. Somewhere outside Ash Hollow, he opened that bounty note one last time under moonlight. The ink was smeared from sweat. Dead. $500. He read it twice. Then he tucked it away again, not in his pocket but beneath the worn lining of his saddle. Like maybe if it wasn't pressed to his heart, it wouldn't bite so deep. Ash Hollow was half awake when Crowe rode in. Just a shimmer of sunrise behind the gallows in the square. The preacher's page fluttered in the breeze. The deputy, barely grown into his badge, saw the shape on the black stallion coming up the road. One glance at that long black duster and the scar riding Crowe's cheek like a lightning bolt, and the kid forgot how to breathe. Inside Nolan's saloon, the drunks sobered up when they heard the boots hit the boards. Sheriff Holt Varner, who once bragged that he'd gut any outlaw dumb enough to test his rope, stiffened at the sight of Crowe's eyes, calm as river ice, promising nothing but graves. No words passed when Crowe tied the stallion to the water post and walked slow to the gallows steps. The crowd rippled, parting around him like cattle scenting a wolf. Josie Marrow, that slip of a girl in a ragged dress, her eye purple and closed, the rope scratching her throat, didn't even flinch. She just watched the sky, not the man they said would come to kill her. Varner's voice cracked, half fear, half command. You got no place here, Crowe. Take your blood coin somewhere else. But Crowe didn't answer. He just raised his revolver, eyes flicking from the hangman to the preacher, to the rope looped like a snake around Josie's throat. The bullet snapped the silence. A single shot. Clean. The frayed rope split a hair above her bruised skin, the noose dropping limp around her shoulders. The preacher gasped. The hangman stumbled back, crossing himself like he'd seen the devil himself slip the knot. Crowe swung up onto the gallows in 3 strides. His coat brushed Josie's arm as he pressed a folded scrap into the preacher's shaking hand. A marriage paper. The ink still wet, but the names clear as sunrise. Josie Marrow and Leland Crowe. The square held its breath. No one moved. Crowe's voice was low, but it cut through the dawn. Get your hands off my wife, or get ready to dig your own graves. Boots scuffled. A bottle shattered somewhere. Sheriff Varner reached for his iron, but Crowe's revolver was already waiting. He didn't have to fire again. Not yet. Instead, he caught Josie just as her knees gave out. She weighed less than the saddle he'd carried half his life, but she was heavier than every secret the Hollow thought it buried. As he lifted her down the gallows steps, Josie's lashes fluttered. She tasted dust and old rope on her tongue. A part of her mind, clear even through the ringing in her skull, wondered. Dead or claimed? What's the difference? But Crow didn't let her think too long. His grip at her waist said what his mouth wouldn't. Not yet. The stallion reared as he swung her up into the saddle. The square exploded behind them. Shouts, boots on boards, the sheriff's cursing drowned by Crow's final shot. A single warning blast that tore the gallows sign clean off its post. And just like that, the girl they called Poison was gone into the dust, carried off by the ghost they'd paid to kill her. The first canyon they found was a crack in the world, wind howling through narrow rock walls like a preacher's warning. Josie rode pressed tight against Crow's chest, head tucked under his chin to block the grit that stung like needles. Every hoofbeat echoed off the red stone, a reminder that the hollow's rope might have snapped, but the hands that tied it still hunted in the dark. By nightfall, the desert dropped from burning to bone-deep cold. Crow reined in by a scrub of mesquite near the canyon's edge and slid from the saddle with Josie half-slumped in his arms. Her lips were split from the sun and the wind, flecks of dried blood staining her chin. She hadn't said a word since the square, hadn't needed to. Words were a luxury people who weren't hunted could afford. They slept the first night under a ledge of rock that barely kept the wind from scraping the skin off their bones. Crow unrolled a moth-eaten blanket, propped his Winchester across his knees, and stared into the thin flame of a fire no bigger than his palm. He didn't watch the stars, didn't trust them. Stars had always been traitors, bright enough to guide a man home, bright enough to guide a bullet to his back. Josie lay curled beside him, boots still on, knees drawn tight to her chest. When she closed her eyes, the noose came back. Same rope, same splintered beams. Only this time she stood in the dust while Crow swung from it. His black coat flapped like a funeral flag. His eyes found hers through the choke of rope and dawn light. In the dream, he didn't struggle. He just looked at her like he'd known all along he'd pay the price for her freedom. She woke with her heart in her throat, breath fogging in the cold air. Crow's hand rested on her boot, heavy, steady, like he needed to be sure she hadn't slipped back to the gallows in the night. He didn't ask what she dreamed. She didn't tell him. They rode at dawn again, Crow's stallion cutting a line through the canyon's dry belly. Sometimes Josie leaned her head back against his shoulder, feeling the rough catch of his coat collar against her cheek. Other times she kept her eyes open wide, counting the ravens circling overhead. They know, she thought once, when a lone bird landed on a stone outcrop and watched them pass. They always know where the bodies are buried. By the third night, Crow found the shepherd's hut tucked between two ridges. Half the roof was caved in, but the stone hearth still held the memory of a fire. The boards above it were blackened from old smoke, carved with the names of men who'd sheltered here long before Crow carried Josie through its broken door. Inside, the place smelled of dry sage and rot. A shattered lantern lay in the corner, glass scattered like fallen stars. Crow set Josie down on a patch of packed earth. She didn't ask if they'd stay. She knew by the slump of his shoulders they'd go again when the sun rose. Always moving, always leaving no tracks but the ones the wind would eat before dawn. As Crow built the fire, Josie traced her fingers along the rotten beam above the hearth. Names scratched deep: Barton, Reyes, C., Talbot. Ghosts who'd passed through. Ghosts who'd left their marks and vanished back into the dust. When Crow was done feeding the flames, he pulled his knife, the same one he'd used to cut her free. He lifted his eyes to Josie once, like asking permission for something he'd already decided. She didn't look away. The blade bit into the wood with slow, careful strokes. Marrow and Crow. He paused, then carved 3 more words beneath it. Ashes don't lie. Josie stood behind him, arms wrapped tight around herself. The wind slipped through the cracked walls, carrying the smell of cedar smoke and old sweat. She felt the tremor in her chest. Not fear, not hope, just the cold truth that whatever they were now, the hollow could never unwrite it. When Crow stepped back, he didn't say a word. He just slid the knife into his boot, dropped onto the blanket beside the fire, and started cleaning his Winchester with the same methodical calm that got them out alive in the first place. Josie ran her thumb over their names, the splinters biting her skin. Ashes don't lie. Neither did the canyon, nor the wind, nor the ghost of a rope that still lingered on her neck like a promise. She settled beside Crowe, close enough to feel the heat of his arm, close enough that the canyon's secrets felt like theirs alone. For one breath, maybe two, the wind outside didn't matter. The hollow could keep its rumors. The canyon would keep their truth. The old coal shaft was a grave long before Josie and Crowe stumbled inside it. It smelled of damp rock and stale air, and the rails that once dragged black gold out of the mountain now rusted like bones under their boots. Crowe could barely stand. He pressed one palm to the jagged hole torn through his shoulder. The bullet had passed clean but left a trail of red that no bandage would fix tonight. Each step made his boots scuff rock louder than he liked, but his eyes stayed sharp, checking every side tunnel, every broken lantern nailed to the beams overhead. He'd known caves like this in the war, holes where men either crawled out alive or didn't crawl out at all. Josie walked behind him, one hand steady on his back, the other gripping a battered revolver she'd never fired until 2 nights ago. Her hair was stiff with sweat and blood. Somewhere in the dark behind them, the desert wind howled through gaps in the timber, a reminder that the men hunting them would never stop at the canyon's edge. They found an old chamber where the ceiling sagged but held. Coal dust stained the walls black, as if the place had been half-burned 100 years ago and left to smolder ever since. Crowe lowered himself onto a pile of rotting planks. He looked smaller without his hat, older without the iron mask he wore in town. For a long moment, he just stared at Josie. Not at her face, but at her hands, rough now, strong where they used to tremble. "You should run," he rasped. His voice was a ghost in the shaft, too weak for the echo. Josie almost laughed, but it came out dry and mean. "Where? Back to the rope they cut for me? Back to Ash Hollow?" She knelt beside him, pressing the rag tighter to his wound. The blood seeped through, warm and sticky. "No, Crowe. If you're stuck here, so am I." It was then that Josie found it. A crate, half buried behind an old coal cart. Sticks of dynamite, brittle with age but dry enough to burn if you begged them right. A coil of fuse still looped tight as a snake. She held one stick in her palm, thumb brushing the faded paper wrap. In her head, the voice came low and sharp. "They called me poison. Maybe they were right, but I choose what I burn." She laid the charges by the narrow mouth of the shaft, the only way in or out. Every footstep sounded like a hammer in her chest. Crowe watched her with one eye cracked open, the other shadowed by pain. He didn't tell her to stop. He knew what it cost to wait for someone else to save you. An hour passed before the boots came. Heavy steps, voices muffled by the bend of the tunnel. Josie pressed her back to the damp wall, fuse gripped tight in one hand, revolver in the other. Rhodes Kincaid came first, his silhouette wide against the faint spill of moonlight behind him. His coat brushed the rock like wings. A smile split his weathered face when he spotted Crowe, slumped but breathing. "Leland Crowe," Rhodes drawled, voice echoing down the shaft. "Ain't this something? You gone soft, brother? Hiding in holes with your little stray instead of finishing the job?" Crowe coughed. Blood flecked his teeth as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You got the wrong man," he rasped. "He died in Ash Hollow." Rhodes' laughter rolled through the tunnels. "Maybe so, but you left a mess, friend, and I'm here to sweep it up." Josie didn't wait to hear more. Her thumb struck the match. The hiss of the fuse sounded louder than her heartbeat. Sparks danced toward the charges while Rhodes's eyes flicked to the crate. Realization too late to matter. "You think you can bury this?" Rhodes snarled. "It never stays buried." The mine roared. Rock and flames slammed the shaft shut like a coffin lid, snapping down on old bones. Dust and heat swallowed the words, the debts, the lies. Josie hit the ground hard, arms thrown over her head. When the blast eased, the world was a haze of drifting grit and the groan of settling beams. She crawled to Crowe, heart hammering so loud she barely heard her own whisper. He was slumped sideways, breath shallow, eyes half closed like sleep might steal him before she could pull him back. She pressed her forehead to his, fingers knotting in his coat. "You die," she hissed into his ear, her voice cracking but sharp as flint. "I bury you here. But if you breathe—" She pressed her palm to his chest, feeling the faint thud under her hand. "If you breathe, you stand with me." Crowe's eyes flickered open, unfocused but alive. His mouth twitched. Not a smile, but the ghost of one. The mind behind them rumbled once more, as if the mountain itself was coughing up the bones of every sin it ever swallowed. Josie leaned back just enough to see his face. Blood and dust smeared across a jaw that had forgotten how to beg. The way his fingers closed around hers was answer enough. She let the tears come, burning trails through the soot on her cheeks. Outside, the night howled past the shattered entrance. Ash Hollow's rope had been cut, their hunters buried under rock and regret. Maybe it would hold. Maybe the past wouldn't come clawing out again. Josie didn't know. She only knew this. For the first time since that frayed noose scraped her throat, she wasn't alone in the dark. And when dawn came, they'd stand, or they'd fall. But they'd do it side by side. Years slipped by like dust on the trail. By the time folks learned to call the squat adobe building at the edge of Sparrow's Rest Josie's lantern, the story of Ash Hollow was already half legend, half lie. The sign above the warped door creaks in the prairie wind, paint faded by sun and time. Inside, the smell of strong coffee and wood smoke drifts through cracked window panes, clinging to the coats of old ranch hands who drift in at dawn. They sit low in their chairs, boots crossed at the ankles, and hush their ghost stories whenever Leland Crowe lifts his eyes from the fire he's feeding behind the stove. Nobody asks how a man like him came to swing a kettle instead of a revolver. Not when they see the scar cutting across his throat like a rope that never quite finished its job. Some say he paid off every sin with blood. Others say he just got tired of bearing secrets for other men. At the counter, a widowed neighbor named Ruthie gossips about weather and cattle and whose boy's gone missing out near the cliffs. She thinks she knows every secret the cafe holds, but when Crowe glances up, her words dry up like spring rain on red clay. Out on the porch, a little girl sweeps the planks in wide, clumsy circles. Mercy, found half-starved at the side of the trail one dusk, taken in without question. She trails Josie like a shadow, stubborn enough to argue, gentle enough to know when to hold her tongue. Some nights Josie lies awake, hand on Mercy's back, listening to her breathe just to remind herself there are still small, unbroken things worth guarding. Sometimes a stranger wanders in off the old stage road, boots crusted with the dust of too many miles. They eye Crowe's rifle propped in the corner, the way his hands never stray too far from it. Then they lean in, voice quiet. "You him? Crowe? You still hunt men for coin?" And Josie stands behind him now, cloth in hand, eyes steady as any bullet. "That man's gone," she says, voice soft but iron at the edges. "He belongs to no one but me." Crowe hammers in a new sign one evening, just as the sun dips behind the hills. M&C's rest stop. When Josie teases him about the fresh paint, he just shrugs, muttering, "A place where stories die if they come hunting." She smiles, a smile the rope never took, and leans her shoulder against his. Out here, the hollow is just a ghost story, and she's the keeper of the lantern that says they're still alive. Some folks say stories like Josie and Crowe's are just old frontier ghosts, but if you listen close, they echo through every small town and coffee shop in America today. Maybe you've never had to cut a noose from your own neck, but we've all felt a rope tighten around our names when folks judge us by rumor instead of truth. In a world that still buries the broken and calls it justice, maybe mercy is the bravest thing left. Crowe could have left Josie swinging in the dust. Josie could have run when he bled out in the mine, but they didn't. They stood beside each other, bruised, haunted, stubborn, and built a place where stories stop at the door if they come hunting. Ask yourself, who would stand beside you when the rope comes? Who would you fight for when the dust settles? Maybe the lesson is that sometimes the family that matters most is the one you choose when the bullets and the lies come down hardest. So tell us, do you think Crowe and Josie ever really outran Ash Hollow? Or does the past always follow, no matter how far you ride? Would you trust a man like Crowe? Would you forgive a girl they once called poison? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one, and we'd love to hear your stories too. If this tale spoke to something deep in you, please hit like, share it with someone who needs a reminder that mercy matters, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove some ghosts deserve to be kept alive. Thanks for riding with us.